Waldensians, sometimes referred to as the Waldenses or Vaudois, were a religious movement that emerged from Western Christianity in the late 12th century, long before the Protestant Reformation. They began as an ascetic group known as the Poor of Lyon, named after their founder Peter Waldo. Waldo, a wealthy merchant, made a dramatic choice around 1173 to give up his possessions and dedicate himself to a life of preaching and poverty, believing that this path reflected true Christian perfection. This decision marked the beginning of the Waldensian movement, which initially gained followers in the Cottian Alps, an area spanning parts of modern-day France and Italy. While the Waldensians shared certain values with the Catholic Church, their refusal to conform to established norms quickly put them at odds with church authorities. Their teachings on apostolic poverty were not in themselves controversial. Other groups like the Franciscans held similar views, but the Waldensians challenged the authority of local bishops by asserting their right to preach without formal approval. By 1215, the Catholic Church officially declared the Waldensians heretics. Pope Innocent III attempted to bring them back into the fold by offering reconciliation to those willing to align with the Church's authority. Some Waldensians accepted this offer and became known as Poor Catholics, but many others chose to remain independent, facing harsh persecution as a result. Despite these challenges, the Waldensian movement endured, spreading into various regions over the centuries. By the 16th century, they found common ground with the emerging Protestant Reformation. The Swiss reformer Heinrich Bullinger played a pivotal role in influencing the Waldensians, and in 1532, at a significant meeting known as the Synod of Clonferrand, the Waldensians officially adopted Calvinist theology, aligning themselves with the broader Protestant movement. From this point forward, they became a part of the Reformed tradition, yet their earlier beliefs and practices remained a distinctive part of their identity. Life was far from easy for the Waldensians, particularly during the 17th century when they faced near annihilation due to severe persecution. Despite these hardships, the movement survived and evolved. In Italy, the Waldensian Evangelical Church became their primary denomination. In 1975, this church merged with the Methodist Evangelical Church to form the Union of Methodist and Waldensian Churches. This organization, predominantly Waldensian, continues to uphold their legacy. Meanwhile, Waldensian congregations also took root in South America, particularly in countries like Argentina, Paraguay, and Uruguay, as well as in North America. Today, organizations like the American Waldensian Society work to preserve their history while promoting values such as social justice, religious freedom, and interfaith dialogue. The Waldensian story has been shaped by centuries of struggle and resilience. Much of what we know about their early beliefs and practices comes from records written by their opponents in the Catholic Church, including inquisitors who condemned them as heretics. These records, though biased, offer glimpses into their doctrines and ways of life. Early Waldensians emphasized the importance of the Bible and rejected practices they viewed as corrupt, such as the veneration of relics, the use of holy water, and the doctrine of purgatory. They upheld principles like voluntary poverty and the priesthood of all believers, believing that any good Christian could serve as a spiritual leader. This egalitarian perspective further set them apart from the hierarchical structure of the Catholic Church. Their beliefs often led to accusations of heresy. They were charged with rejecting the authority of the Pope and the clergy, criticizing church practices such as tithes and celibacy for priests, and dismissing Catholic sacraments as invalid if performed by sinful priests. The Waldensians also rejected the idea that physical objects, like bones of saints or holy water, held any special power. They taught that prayer could be just as effective in a simple barn as in a grand cathedral, and they questioned the Church's emphasis on wealth and ceremony. Over time, as the Waldensians came into contact with Reformation theology, some of their earlier practices and beliefs shifted. For example, while they originally defended the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, they later adopted a more symbolic interpretation. Similarly, their stance on infant baptism evolved as they embraced doctrines aligned with Calvinist theology. However, the core of their faith, a commitment to the Bible, a focus on simplicity and poverty, and a willingness to challenge authority, remained constant. In the movement's earliest days, Waldensians would gather in secret, often in homes or remote locations, to confess sins and share in worship. They relied on itinerant preachers known as barbas, who traveled from town to town, offering spiritual guidance and strengthening the community. This grassroots approach allowed them to maintain their faith and spread their teachings even in the face of intense persecution. The Catholic Church's efforts to suppress the Waldensians included excommunication, mass executions, and even crusades. In 1487, Pope Innocent VIII issued a bull calling for the extermination of the Vaudois. This led to military campaigns that devastated Waldensian communities, forcing many to flee to remote regions or seek refuge in neighboring countries. Despite these efforts, the Waldensians proved remarkably resilient, preserving their identity and beliefs through centuries of hardship. And the Reformation had started making waves, and news of it finally reached the secluded Waldensian valleys. For the Waldensians, who had lived in isolation with their distinct Christian beliefs, this was a pivotal moment. Their leadership, the Tavola Valdese, saw potential in aligning with the Reformation's ideals. So, in 1526, they convened in the town of Lau, in the Chizone Valley, to make an important decision: to send envoys to explore this new Protestant movement. By 1532, the Waldensians had taken a monumental step. They met with German and Swiss Protestants, including figures like William Farel and Anthony Saunier, who were leading voices of the Reformed Church. This meeting, held in Chanforan on October 12, marked a turning point. Farel urged them to leave secrecy behind and fully embrace the Reformation. The Waldensians agreed, adopting a new confession of faith aligned with Reformed doctrines. They also decided to conduct worship services openly in French, signaling a bold shift toward integrating into the wider Protestant movement. A remarkable development during this period was the translation of the Bible into French. Pierre Robert Olivetan, with help from John Calvin, produced this translation in 1535. Interestingly, the Waldensians' own vernacular New Testament influenced this work. To support its publication, the Waldensian churches gathered an impressive 1,500 gold crowns, a testament to their dedication. However, this newfound openness came at a cost. Outside the safety of their valleys, the Waldensians faced growing hostility. In Provence, reports of their sedition reached French King Francis I, who responded with brutal force. On January 1, 1545, he issued the Arrêt de Mirandol, assembling an army to crush the Waldensians in Provence. The result was the massacre of Mirandol, a horrific campaign led by Jean-Manier d'Oppede and Antoine Escaline des Aymars. Villages were destroyed, and estimates of the dead ranged from hundreds to thousands. This marked the beginning of a dark era for the Waldensians. Despite occasional treaties, like the one in 1561, that granted amnesty and freedom of worship, the Waldensians remained vulnerable. The French Wars of Religion from 1562 to 1598 brought fresh waves of persecution. Even the Edict of Nantes in 1598, which granted some rights to Protestants under King Henry IV, offered only temporary respite. By the 17th century, the Duke of Savoy sought to eliminate the Waldensians altogether, culminating in the horrific events of 1655, known as the Piedmont Easter. The Duke issued an ultimatum in January 1655. The Waldensians must either attend Mass or abandon their homes in the lower valleys and retreat to the upper valleys. It was the dead of winter, but most chose to leave their homes rather than betray their faith. They trekked through icy waters and snow-covered peaks to find refuge with their brethren in the upper valleys. Their defiance infuriated the Duke, who responded with treachery. Under the pretense of quelling unrest, his troops were quartered in Waldensian homes. But on April 24, 1655, at 4 a.m., a signal was given, and the troops unleashed an unimaginable massacre. The atrocities were beyond words. Reports from survivors describe children torn from their mothers, elderly people burned alive, and entire families brutally tortured and murdered. The massacre was so gruesome that it shocked Europe. Protestant rulers rallied in support of the Waldensians. Oliver Cromwell in England called for a day of fasting, raised funds, and even threatened military action. John Milton penned his famous sonnet, "On the Late Massacre in Piedmont," immortalizing the tragedy in verse. Meanwhile, Swiss and Dutch Calvinists organized a covert escape network, helping survivors flee to Switzerland and the Netherlands. Some even found refuge in the New World, settling in the Dutch colony of Delaware in 1656. Back in Europe, those who remained formed a resistance movement led by Joshua Janavel, a farmer-turned-military leader. They engaged in guerrilla warfare against their oppressors, holding their ground well into the 1660s. But the persecution didn't stop. In 1685, Louis XIV revoked the Edict of Nantes, stripping French Protestants of their rights. The Waldensians in France faced forced conversions and exile, with thousands fleeing to Germany. In the Piedmont, Victor Amadeus II, the Duke of Savoy, followed suit. In 1686, he ordered the destruction of Waldensian churches and demanded that they renounce their faith or face death. Once again, the Waldensians resisted. Armed with their unwavering faith and a fierce determination, they stood their ground against an army of 9,000 French and Piedmontese soldiers. By April, however, they were outnumbered and outmatched. Many were killed, imprisoned, or forcibly converted. Yet, a small group, the Invincibles, fled to the hills and waged a year-long guerrilla campaign. Their persistence forced the Duke to negotiate, eventually granting safe passage to Geneva for the remaining Waldensians. But even that journey was perilous, with many perishing along the way. And by 1689, the Waldensians made their glorious return under the leadership of Pastor Henri Arnaud. With support from European allies, they reclaimed their homeland, though at great cost. And the story of the Waldensians didn't just end with the granting of religious freedom after the French Revolution. Once they were finally allowed to practice their faith openly, their journey took on a whole new dimension. In 1848, King Charles Albert of Sardinia granted the Waldensians full civil rights, a groundbreaking moment for this resilient community. With newfound freedom, they began expanding beyond their traditional valleys in Piedmont. Some ventured into the Italian peninsula, building congregations through migration and preaching. But the truth is, life was still tough. Many faced poverty and discrimination, so they sought better opportunities abroad. And here's where it gets really interesting. These folks didn't just stick close to home, they went global. First, they moved to nearby places like the French Riviera and Switzerland. But soon, they crossed oceans, founding settlements like Colonia Valdense in Uruguay and Jacinto Arauz in Argentina. By the late 19th century, many Waldensians even made it to the United States, building vibrant communities in places like Missouri and North Carolina. Imagine this, a tight-knit group from the Alps creating new lives in the Americas, all while holding on to their faith and heritage. How cool is that? Back in Italy, things were looking up too. Over time, the Waldensians started climbing the social ladder. Some even made a name for themselves in Turin's booming chocolate industry. Fun fact, they're credited with inventing Gianduja, that delicious hazelnut chocolate we all love. And here's another fascinating layer. Education and scholarship flourished. By 1855, the Waldensians had their own college to train ministers, which eventually relocated to Rome. They also preserved ancient manuscripts, fueling a deeper understanding of their history and theology. Writers like Italo Calvino and politicians like Valdo Spini emerged from this community, blending faith with intellectual and cultural contributions. Fast forward to 2015, and we have a historic moment of reconciliation. Pope Francis, during a visit to a Waldensian temple in Turin, formally apologized for centuries of persecution by the Catholic Church. This wasn't just symbolic, it was a step toward healing deep historical wounds. Today, the Waldensian Church identifies as Protestant, part of the Reformed tradition. They emphasize core values like serving marginalized communities, promoting social justice, and fostering interfaith dialogue. They've come a long way from their persecuted past, becoming a vibrant global community that values respect for religious diversity.